Trump is a 60s liberal's dream come true. The left media protests and condoning war. For the left, this boy's or transgender girl's right to use the girls' showers is as equally important as this man's right to vote. Would the 60s idealists have claimed that white people should not wear Halloween costumes such as Mexican musician because this is cultural appropriation, stealing the culture of other races, thus this woman's right not to feel offended by a Halloween costume is as equally important as this man's right to vote? Most liberals were enticed to follow the Democratic Party, and thus as the party transformed into a socialist party in all but in name, enforcing cultural Marxism, liberal citizens became leftists, sometimes without even knowing it. But the left went from protesting for more freedom to protesting for more oppression. Liberals, true to the ideals they had in their youth, are the ones who stayed clear of this left. Also, especially in Europe, where the left was more popular, left meant focus on the economy and labor rights, labor laws, protection of the working class, and better salaries and wages. It would have been inconceivable to these people that in the future there would be an election where the left would pay absolutely no attention to the economy and the working class, but focus on a host of newly invented issues, mostly concerning protecting minorities' feelings. One possibility is the left does not care about workers. The other possibility is a deeper consideration, because it is true there is not much need for the left to occupy itself with the economy. Labor laws are good enough, so more legislation, more government intrusion could actually worsen the economy, increase unemployment, and hurt the working class. At most, depending on the country, only minor adjustments may be needed to things like minimum wage. But if this is the case, then it proves the left has no real reason to exist, so it must invent a reason to exist, creating minorities in order to protect them. It's like a firefighter setting fire to homes in order to have to put out the fires and thus justify his salary. This was not the purported change liberals wanted to make in the 60s. Convincing people that they should not see themselves as individuals who are part of the nation but happen to be different in some respect because they are black or gay, etc., but see themselves first as a member of a different group who happens to be part of a nation or even not part of the nation because the nation, consisting mostly of a white majority, is their enemy. Actually, hate is very powerful and enjoyable. That is why these people are enjoying their hatred for Trump. Consider conservatives and libertarians, people who do not burn, do not violently attack their political opponents, who do not express the same hate against the president they do not like and against his voters, but remain more civil. Aren't these people more tolerant, more hip than these people? There are hateful comments and spoofs from both sides, but with regard to the majority of protesters and all journalists on the two sides, there was none of this against Obama by moderate, conservative, and libertarian future Trump voters. These instances are the worst one can find, but they do not compare in numbers or percentage to those of the left. And there was none of this. And this is because of their different backgrounds, democracy versus the wish to impose dictatorship by means of disuniting the people and creating a mentality for civil war. Fanatics existed in the 60s, such as these terrorists, but as they have existed in every time period, cannot be said to represent the spirit of the decade for which it became known. Thus, this entire line of the left comes from one source. Suffice it to say that these leftist terrorists became part of the official establishment as university professors, while non-leftist, moderate and conservative speakers and students are attacked for their opinion. They became part of the establishment not in order to present yet another opinion along with the others, but to impose only one opinion. Why should one care about the opinions the liberals and hippies had back then in the 60s and not about their opinions now that they are old and mature? Because the American allure to the entire world has been the rebel, cowboy, capitalist inventor, star, hippie. They do not hold fascination now. The left tries to gain advantage with the young by attaching itself to the star power of the 60s. But although the hippies did not realize how lucky they were to live in a Western society and how small the changes and adjustments needed for improvement had to be, by living in a conservative age, the hippies were at the forefront, were new, beautiful, and innocent. Nothing of the real left is new, beautiful, or innocent. Ideological communists became part of the 60s scene and tried to push it in a direction favorable to them, but actually communists were the most anti-60s element. If communists actually governed, they would have eliminated hippies and protests. There were no hippies, no protests, and no Woodstock in communist countries. At the very height of the 60s, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 to wipe out any democratic feeling. There may have been liberal hippies who happened to be communist sympathizers, but this was because they were ignorant, naive, and did not understand that liberalism and communism are opposites and cannot coexist. These youngsters in Czechoslovakia may be called rebels, participating in the struggle against communism. These communists, living in freedom and comfort in the United States, were only pretending to be rebels, no different from children pretending to be cowboys and Indians. It is hard to believe that these people are not organized fanatic leftists, or at least terribly brainwashed by their schools and media, and that instead they spontaneously came to the conclusion that the worst thing in the country is Trump, and that they had to go out and protest. These are protests in different countries in support of free mass immigration. Not one of these people is a humanitarian unless he opposes war more than he supports mass immigration, unless he opposed Hillary Clinton more than he opposed Trump. This is a lie. The truth is they are all imperialists who easily accept war. They did not demonstrate, as in the 60s, against the politicians wanting war, but instead supported them. These people saying no hate, keeping in mind their mentality, is nearly as ridiculous as these people saying it would be. Demanding that their ideological opponent's opinion be banned means they want the state to have the power to do this. This is not power to the people, this is power to the state. This is not revolution, but oppression. It is not conservative oppression, but leftist oppression. Now that the establishment has become leftist, these people are not against the establishment. They are soldiers, employees of the state and the elite, as what they want, multiculturalism and mass immigration, is supported by the politicians of both parties, with the exception of a small percentage of the Republicans and President Trump. It is just that the Democrats support these openly while the Republicans secretly. It is true that these fanatics may be dangerous, but they're not dangerous to the state. They are dangerous to moderate, logical citizens, the majority, the people, whom they call racists in order to justify their oppression. Simply put, they support the wishes of the politicians and are against the people. They do not belong to the category of rebels, but that of oppressors. Was this a dream of the 60s liberals? It clearly was the dream of the 60s radicals, who were simply communists that chose a name more enticing to the young. Were there any anti-Marxist radicals? Leaving aside the Marxist so-called radicals, the 60s liberals may or may not be among these people, but even if they are not, if they refuse to passionately condemn these leftist fanatics who hate democracy and freedom of speech, or at least condemn them more than they condemn President Trump, then they are not liberal, but facilitators of a fascist mentality. These people are dangerous to moderate, logical citizens, the majority, the people, as most moderate people do not like the idea of protesting, and thus they allow the fanatic minority to rule the streets. If moderates protested, they would overwhelm the fanatics 20-1 or 30-1. Historian Toynbee of the Wellington House propaganda organization, later renamed Tavistock, which promotes internationalism, claimed that the greatest accomplishment is to blur the lines between work and play. Make people work for the system, but think they're doing something that they like. Believe they're engaging in revolution, opposing the system, resistance, anything. Now, young people may think, we want to have a 60s moment too, and be rebels. Well, they can't have it. It's like saying, I want to be like the greatest generation and fight totalitarianism in Europe, as in World War II, so let's invade Normandy again now. If someone else has successfully put out a fire, you cannot put it out too to emulate his success, unless you start another fire. Saying that this is the same as this is like saying creating the horrific Syrian civil war is like fighting totalitarianism in World War II. Perhaps if the media wanted, they could have made young people in the 60s overly emotional and illogical, made them anti-patriotic, and made them believe their country is racist, homophobic, sexist, and that this is not simply something that all countries have to deal with, but that their country specifically is evil. Well, these problems are to be forgiven in Muslim or African countries. In other words, whites are evil for their wars or racism, but other races with the same or worse history of wars and racism, slavery, and inequality are not evil, but admirable. But it is also likely that the young in the 60s, coming from a more logical, pragmatic society and family upbringing, would not be tricked, would reject easy emotionalism, and refuse to abandon logic. After all, the 60s generation opposition to war, racism, and restrictions on expression was a move towards more logic. It was not a move away from their parents' beliefs, but a continuation and completion of their beliefs. It was a clash between relatively good and better, from democracy, family, and patriotism to democracy, family, and patriotism, and more equality, tolerance, and open-mindedness. The idea was not to destroy or substitute the old values, but to add to them. It was like the Age of Enlightenment, a move towards more logic. The modern youth, coming from a less logical society and family upbringing, are easier targets for the media. In the past, being an idealist meant believing in logic. People tried to change the irrational, unfair institutions in their society that favored the aristocracy with different sets of laws, rights, and privileges for different classes, and which severely restricted freedom of speech, occupation, etc. This is why it was called the Age of Reason. Now, being an idealist means believing in emotion and abandoning logic. So-called idealists demand opening the border to let in hundreds of millions who wish to immigrate to the West, the state borrowing endlessly to give more welfare, thus establishing the danger of a future economic collapse, releasing criminals from prison, anything that sounds pleasant now, but which will have terrible consequences in the future, because idealism now means being irresponsible. They were not perfect. Like all people, and especially young people, they could easily have been manipulated, as young people are now, brainwashed that having a border is racist, or that free speech should be banned if the media says it is racist. But then, there being two choices, the establishment and the counterculture, the youth often chose the second. Now the establishment is leftist, but the young seem to be more easily convinced by the establishment, perhaps because the leftist establishment is more absolute and one-sided in its brainwash than the conservative establishment used to be. Perhaps it was only a coincidence that what the young people believed then happened to be good things, as opposed to ridiculous and dangerous, happened to be on the side of democracy instead of against it. But they were commonsensical as opposed to illogical, thus this has to be credited to them, and the conservative society and conservative parents who raised them to believe in democracy. Their children had different ideas, but remained on the side of democracy and logic. Many children now grow up in a society that promotes a different upbringing, and they have parents of a different sort who instill different values or no values in them, making it easier for them to choose not to change as in improve their society, but to change as in destroy it. There are moderate logical conservatives who wish to conserve the good things in their society. But conservative in a bad sense is someone who opposes anything new and who has blind faith in the establishment, the media, and education system. Many young people today become conservative in this sense. Name one thing on which you disagree with the media. Young or emotional people today can forgive killing 500,000 people and destroying the lives of tens of millions by engineering 2 civil wars, but cannot forgive unkind, insulting words. If the counterculture is opposition to the establishment, then Trump was the counterculture candidate, and the people bringing him to power for the first time defeated such massive established determination. Can anyone believe that these people are patriots, who used to be against the Soviet Union and now want to protect their nation from being substituted by means of mass immigration? Civilized people agree to disagree. Barbarians, even when they agree, disagree that they agree. These people perhaps could have been convinced by the media that the white race is the worst of all. But that is not what they believed in. They did not believe that the white race is evil, and did not believe that European nations must be substituted by multiracial constructs. But now these ideas are accepted and even promoted by the extremists whom the media disguises as moderate centrists. When people no longer believe in God, they may believe in anything. This is not exactly correct. The loss of old standard beliefs does not necessarily result in this if one is a logical person who has an analytical mind, observation, facts, conclusions. But many people, especially among the young, who desperately wish to believe in something, to belong to something, are easily tricked to believe in anything. When old conservative values are lost, then it is not new, logical, moderate values that are the most appealing, but ridiculous, extreme, revolutionary ideas. These are the most pleasing. And the more absolute the belief is, the better it is for them. The more they can believe in it, and the more pleasure they take from it. Politics is mostly gray, but gray is unpleasant. It means you must take the trouble to learn, check which side is right on one issue and which side is right on another issue, and to what extent each side is right. But believing politics is only black and white is pleasant. Whether it is one black and white or the other black and white, it is easy, requires no trouble, and provides the opportunity for protest. But politics is like this, or even this, or keeping in mind the spirit of the age, this. The young are shaped by the environment, made to hate Jews, Germans called Huns in World War I, or Trump, and encouraged to find camaraderie in groups, Hitler Youth, Islamic fanatics, and violent leftist groups. There is no need to wonder why these young people, at least those who are not paid a salary to protest, or are not openly or secretly communists, are so fanatic. It is because they have been brought up by school, media, and some by parents to be fanatics. These children did not choose their ideology any more than people in the Middle Ages or Islamic countries today choose their religion. As the left uses only emotionalism and has no logical arguments, the left always emphasizes emotion and condemns logic so as to bring the young to its side. Whatever these people are resisting, it is not the rich elite or the government because they support or even pay these people to protest. The mentality of the left is seen here. This small minority believes they have the right to stop something because they do not like it. They claim a president elected by the people is not welcome. They will decide if he is welcome or not. The election does not count. They decide instead. They may even believe they speak on behalf of all humanity. The foundation of all leftist attacks and accusations of racism against any non-leftist, including Trump, is, if you disagree that there is institutionalized racism against minorities, you are a racist. This is willingly believing lies that serve the elite in its goal to bring disunity and discord to society. Of course, there are still racist individuals, but there is no longer institutionalized racism. Believe in something, but when you desperately want to believe in something, you may believe in anything. Convictions mean beliefs. Convictions also mean imprisonment. Here, imprisonment of the mind. There is no mention of, hear both sides. Do not get carried away by what sounds pleasing. Pay attention to facts, not rhetoric. Be objective. In the 60s, as many developed a mindset that the top priority is having a good time, and thus wished to believe in what sounds good and pleasant because this gave them pleasure, instead of learning and examining what is true and what works and what does not, this irresponsible attitude led many to wholeheartedly accept the pleasant lies of the left in order to believe they are part of a revolutionary movement. Some 60s liberals became moderates, others became leftists brainwashed by the media and education establishment, and others became the brainwashers themselves, the teachers and journalists. This is the better world that the 60s liberals imagined. The results of unchecked mass immigration, when nations do not decide which immigrants to accept, but must accept nearly everyone that shows up. Punishing people for opinions expressed on the internet. And the orchestration of war and civil war, conducted this time primarily by the leftist multiculturalists who support mass immigration and oppose free speech. After all, the leftist dogma is change, not improvement, not only the kind of change that brings improvement. If the slogan was change for improvement, it would be obvious that the left has failed. It is true that all this is a bipartisan effort conducted by politicians from the left and right, but with regard to the people, it is mostly leftists who support or accept these policies. Thus, the left opposed the supposedly oppressive establishment of the past in order not to do away with it, but to take over it and become the new establishment. But it would not make the same mistakes as the old one that lost its grip on power. The leftist establishment is to be more oppressive in order to keep control. The old establishment allowed free speech and did not attack the meetings even of communists, even when the nation was facing the possibility of nuclear war. But leftists intend to be more successful in keeping power by being more oppressive. The intent is not to become ungovernable, but to become the new government, as these people are already acting as if they are the government, as if they are the police, as they decide who has the right to speak and who does not. If fascism is illegal and the left determines what fascism is, then the left can claim that anything is fascist and forbid it. Promoting communism that killed 80 million people is acceptable. Trump is not. Even the supposed moderate left does not condemn leftist violence or condemns it less than 1% of the time. They condemn mere comments from non-leftists, showing they actually tacitly approve of it. Imagine the 60s Woodstock today, with complaints over misogynistic rock songs and cultural appropriation of blues songs, regulations that 50% of electric guitar players be women, because of sensitive people clapping being banned and substituted by jazz hands, and kneeling during the rendition of the national anthem by electric guitar. In one movie, a police officer is brought back to life decades later when society had completely changed, where using foul language or insulting anyone is banned. Eating red meat, smoking, alcohol are all banned. He ends up sympathizing with the man who is the supposed terrorist because he wishes to return society to logic before the madness appeared. Similarly, if a person from the 60s were brought to the modern dystopia directly from the 60s who has not suffered 50 years of media brainwash since that time and saw the dystopia, he would sympathize with all those wishing to return their society to the time before the madness set in. All the fury against Trump boils down to one cause. We hate Trump because the establishment media told us to hate him. If these young people are not among those paid by George Soros money, or are not essentially young communists disguised as liberals, then the fact that they are protesting against Trump and not against Obama and Clinton means that they care more about supposed racist comments by Trump than about war by Obama and Clinton. Leaving the immigration issue aside, even if one is convinced by the media that Trump is racist, his racism has had no effect on anyone and has not hurt anyone, except perhaps some people's feelings. Thus, these young people choose to protest about hurt feelings, not about war. Perhaps they are angry that Trump does not agree that these people have the right to limit free speech that hurts some people's feelings. Imagine if people in the 60s never protested about war, but instead joined white racists to protest about the hurt feelings of whites or the hurt feelings of racists, and joined forces with the Ku Klux Klan as now they joined forces with communists. It does not get more ridiculous than this. Protesting against the only presidential candidate in 30 years who wanted to stop wars, and claiming you support peace, and quite possibly having voted for a warmonger. From fighting against the rich instead of fighting their wars, to taking the side of the rich and supporting the wars of the rich, without shame. No Trump and no war. A contradiction in terms. Without Trump, there would be war. More Nazis tried to stop Hitler than Democrats tried to stop Obama and Hillary in their wars, and they did not have to sacrifice their lives to do it like these Germans, but only risk a little damage to their career. The people who voted for Hitler did so before he started his wars. The people who voted for Hillary Clinton did so after she had started her war, killing nearly 500,000 people after they already knew what kind of person she is. Not wanting too many Muslim immigrants in your country is racist. Killing Muslims in their own country is all right. Anyone who was against the Vietnam War, or at least neutral or not completely in favor of that war, today would have to be far, far more against the wars in Iraq and Syria for regime change. Especially when considering that after the official victims of the war, there were more hundreds of thousands who died as a result of the consequences. If anyone feels more fury against President Nixon for fighting a war against communism, and less fury or no fury against Bush and Obama for killing 1 million people in unnecessary wars, then he is a narrow-minded person who judges not by facts but by media emotionalism, the exact kind of person that the 60s mentality supposedly opposed. And incidentally, Nixon covered up an illegal attempt to acquire information by means of burglary. The two previous presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, did not cover up, but actually perpetrated themselves illegal attempts to acquire information by means of wiretapping journalists and politicians, done not for national security, but political gain. The left had condemned President Bush's war in Iraq that killed 150,000 people to depose a brutal dictator who had killed 100,000 Kurds, 1 million people in a war against Iran, invaded one country and sent missiles against another. But the left largely did not condemn or even supported President Obama's war that killed more people against a much softer dictator or president who did not kill his Kurds, did not kill 1 million people in a war, and did not invade or launch missiles against other countries, and allowed an elected parliament. Libya was the country where a larger percentage of people lived well than in any other country in Africa, and where women had more freedom than in nearly any other Muslim country. Libya after Hillary's war. No matter what leftists in power do, there are supposedly other leftists who are honest until they prove otherwise. Bernie is hilarious. If a 60s liberal today were forced to make a strict choice between imposing bans on offensive Halloween costumes, imposing transgender bathrooms, and imposing limitations on free speech to protect the feelings of minorities, or stopping a war, and chose the first, then, according to the 60s mentality, he could only be described as despicable. Why are leftists who used to protest against imperialist wars not saying that at least on this one issue they support Trump's decision to avoid a war and instead remove American soldiers from Syria? Because, as one writer claims a 60s leftist had told him, the issue leftists are protesting about is never the issue. The issue is to make the people feel anger and oppose the government when they do not like its policy, or oppose social norms and conquer power. War or Syria was never the issue. These leftist articles present all the condemnation against Trump, but do not have anything good to say about Trump's decision except one single line. This article presents a video with the people who condemn Trump without one word in his support, even though it is from a leftist site that pretends to be against American involvement in wars. Many judged presidents, mostly 50 to 60%, by their war policy, If this is applied to more recent presidents, then even if all the accusations against Trump were true, as he chose peace while previous presidents chose war, Trump is still better than Bush and Obama. Judging the presidents by their war policy, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton would be the worst. On an arbitrary scale, we could use as a point of comparison the number 20. Then, President Bush would be slightly better, Nixon much more preferable as his war was against communism, and Trump the most preferable of all as he avoided unnecessary wars. Even if one believes that the ideal for a president is much higher or very much higher, and even that Trump is below terrible, the comparison between the presidents from best to worst holds. There is only one argument that the Vietnam War was worse, and that is that American soldiers were dying in large numbers in Vietnam, while in Syria it is enormous numbers of non-Americans, and we do not care about them. This is not idealistic, but self-serving. It may be logical to wish that your countrymen do not die in war, but happily accepting a war that kills other people is ruthless, nationalist, racist chauvinism perpetrated by the leftist supporters for the war on Syria. One quick comment about a historical view, but without a conclusion. Choosing not to fight in Vietnam can be seen as a decision based on either the belief that there was lack of necessity for that war, or that it was cowardice disguised as pacifism and forward thinking. To understand how many belong to one side or the other, we would have to know how many of those who refused to fight in Vietnam would have chosen to fight in World War II if the Nazis suddenly reappeared in the 60s and started conquering Europe. The fact is that the 60s generation did not care very much about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. If the Soviets, like the Nazis before them, had shown signs of continued aggression and invaded, for example, West Germany or Finland, would the 60s people who did not wish to fight in Vietnam have chosen to fight against the Soviet Union? Those who would choose not to would have as an only excuse the idea that it is not necessary to stop the Soviet conquest of all Europe because World War II was not necessary either to stop the Nazi conquest of Europe. We should have let Hitler win. Thus, for someone to be honest and not a hypocrite, he would have to either have the guts to fight in the imaginary scenario of a Europe-wide Soviet invasion, or have the guts to claim that we should have accepted Hitler and allowed him to win, meaning have the guts to claim the most unfashionable thing in the 60s. Imagine if the media did not focus on Trump, offensive, racist, impeach, treason, but instead on immigrant crime and war debt. How different people's perceptions of their country's situation would be. A few years ago, Trump's statements against illegal immigration would have been considered completely normal. Now they are considered racist only because the media put this idea in people's minds. A person reads statements from Democratic politicians against illegal immigration, but pretends the statements are from President Trump.
I'm going to read a few quotes here from President Trump talking about the need for the southern border wall. First quote, "We should spend money to build a barrier to prevent illegal immigrants from coming in." Another quote, "We simply cannot allow people to pour into the U.S. undetected, undocumented, and unchecked." Quote, "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. Until the American people are convinced we will stop future flows of illegal immigration, we'll make no progress." When you hear quotes like that, what's your reaction to them?
It's divisive.
I just really think it's kind of hateful speech in general. It kind of underlies a lot of things about like discrimination and people and their prejudice.
There are racial biases.
Overall, it's just unacceptable.
It's very dehumanizing.
What if I told you these were from Chuck Schumer, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton?
Thus, the media used to accept these statements as normal, but now pretends they are racist, and does a convincing job. Only leftists go and counter-protest aggressively at the meeting place of their political opponents. When they approach too close to the meeting place, then by definition the intention of leftists is violence. They are always the ones to start the violence. After violence that as usual leftists started, but during which a right-winger killed a leftist, Trump condemned both the far right and far left, but said there may be good people on both sides. No one could misunderstand this and think the statement supports one side. Yet the media convinced many that the statement supported the far right, which is as ridiculous as saying that it supported the far left. How absolute the media false reporting and brainwash is can be seen in this example, one of many. When Trump said 4 congresswomen of minority and immigrant background who wish to impose socialism and mass-scale immigration should first go to their countries, implement their political experiments on those countries, and when and if they succeed, come back to the United States and impose them on the United States too, but only after they show they are successful in those countries, the United States should not be the guinea pig. The established media reported this not as a comment about choice of policies, but as a wish that they leave the United States. For weeks, the media continued to mention the issue by only reporting the go back part, and not mentioning, but instead hiding, the come back part. Obedience to the establishment's media was not a 60s ideal. By the 1960s, many had understood that in the West, the end of history had come, meaning everything that mattered had already been achieved: democracy, freedom, equal rights. Capitalism was working, and all the reasonable parts of socialism had already been added to the system of the Western countries. It was all downhill from then. Only minor adjustments and reforms needed attention. All that was needed was to protect the achievement. Imagine a nation that reaches a point in its history when it is wealthier than ever, with more equality than ever, whose population does not need to struggle for, but merely choose to have peace and freedom, but is attacked by a fringe ideology that takes over the state, the media, and schools, all of whom together make people believe that they are miserable, that they are mistreated, that they should believe in every new, strange, exotic idea that the establishment promotes, and that they should hate anyone who disagrees with these new ideas and forbid him to speak his opinion, because if anyone disagrees with the media, it means he is full of hate and is dangerous and must be stopped. Imagine that this totalitarian ideology is not like others that started from a fringe group and then conquered the state, but is one that started from the elite, the ultra-rich, and the state themselves. It takes over people's minds so that they perceive not their real condition, but a distorted, false image of despair, and that the nation's generation, whose mindset and youthful camaraderie has been envied more than any other for the ideals which are now taken for granted, when the time comes to defend the ideals which had been accepted but are now in danger, and to finally implement the remaining ideal, is conspicuously absent. Its place having been taken by those whose ideals are not in opposition to the establishment, but in the service of the establishment, for whom the old ideals are inconsequential. Freedom, to be sacrificed for the sake of the imposition of an exotic form of equality. Unity, to be sacrificed for the sake of breaking society into identity groups. And peace, to be sacrificed for the sake of electing the facilitators of this mindlessness.